Okay, welcome everyone to the Chapter 1 webinar, Statistic Solutions. I think most everybody's here. Everybody hear me? I'm assuming. Okay. Yeah, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, you're welcome to ask questions in the question and answer box as we proceed, but I won't get to them until the end. Also, everyone who is here or who has even signed up, and even if you're not here, you will all get a copy of the PowerPoint presentation, including the slides and the audio component. Okay. So yeah, Chapter 1, and this is for the non-methodological sections of Chapter 1. For the research questions specifically, and nature of the study or the study design components of Chapter 1, we do offer webinars specifically on research questions and the methodology and the methodological components of the chapter. So those would be separate, and so just check our schedule for when we're offering those webinars. But this is for the non-methodological sections, which is most of Chapter 1. Okay. So as you know, the Chapter 1 is the introduction to the dissertation. It is, think of it as kind of the blueprint. It's kind of the plan for the study. It tells you it's going to tell your reader what you're going to be doing, what your topic is, what your research problem is, what your focus is within that topic, how you're going to be doing your study, and why. Okay, so the big, the what, how, and why questions are being answered in Chapter 1. And again, it's kind of a plan or blueprint about what you're going to be doing and why and how you're going to be doing it. All right, these are the components that we're going to be covering today, the non-methodological parts. The introduction to the Chapter 1, background, research problem, purpose, theoretical framework, definition, significance, and there's a few other sections I've kind of collapsed into one section because some schools require them, some schools don't, and the summary. And yeah, just to know before we start moving forward, you always want to get your school's template for the dissertation, for the chapters, if they have one. Most schools do. But the reason for that is obvious. They want you to follow their template. And to be fair, most templates are similar. The requirements are going to be similar across schools, but there will be differences. So what I'm going to show you is a good general template. So if your school doesn't have one, this is something you could follow. But whenever possible, get your school specific template, because they may have some particulars that they want specifically. Okay. The introduction of the Chapter 1, just like introduction, it's going to introduce your topic and kind of give you just a real broad picture of your topic and why you're going to focus on that topic. So usually you have a research problem, but your research problem will be based on some kind of organizational or social problem. So, for example, if you're studying teachers or you're in education, there may be, let's say, for example, a problem with retention of special education teachers. That they just, it's just hard to retain them. The turnover, is very high. So that's your organizational problem. That's where things kind of start. Then from there, there's a research problem. So In other words, what do we know already about retention and retaining special education teachers? Okay, we know these certain things, but there's a gap in the literature. There's something the literature is not addressing. And that would be the research problem. So your research problem was always based on an organizational problem. So in the introduction, it's best to kind of set out that organizational problem first. Sometimes statistics are good. So many special education teachers are leaving the field, which obviously can create gaps in delivery. Back that up with some numbers, and then get to what it is, that you'll be doing specifically. What is the actual gap in the research? What is the actual problem in the research? And that leads to why your study will be needed. Okay, so it's an introduction of the topic in kind of a wide, kind of a broad way, but then it kind of funnels down a little bit to specifically what you're going to be doing. Let's see. Okay, still part of the introduction. Yeah, when you get to the research problem part, state what is needed to address the research problem. How is your study designed to address the research problem? So at the end of the section, your reader should know what you're studying and why. Obviously, the details about that are going to be coming throughout the chapter, but this is just kind of an overview of the social problem, the research problem, and why your study is needed. And people always think they need to, because the introduction comes at the beginning of the chapter, that you need to start with the introduction. And I always say, how can you introduce something that you don't know what you're introducing yet? So in other words, if you have to put a placeholder in for your introduction until you write, get a better sense of what you're doing in the chapter, you can always come back to the introduction, right? Because then you can see what you have and what you're doing. And it's easier, I think it's easier to write the introduction after you've got a good handle on most of the chapter, rather than thinking that you have to start with it, even though for the reader, that's what it seems like. Okay, so introduction to the topic, what the problem's based on, what the research problem is, how your study is designed to help address that research problem. And you may end the section if you want. A lot of times you can end the section with a preview of the sections of the chapter, like a preview of what's going to come in the chapter, what's contained in the chapter. Okay, the background is the next section. This is the background to the problem. So it's more specifically, sorry about the dog in the background, working from home. The background is the research on the topic to date. And this is kind of, you don't have to go back. I know that sounds like a lot. It has a historical focus, but mostly you want to focus. It's a broad strokes kind of a section. What are some of the major trends? Where's the problem been? What are some of the major trends in the research? How have researchers sought to address this in the past? So it kind of gets the reader up to speed on here's where the problem has been. Here's what researchers have done to address it. Some of the major trends in the research. So that lets the reader know where things stand research on the topic. And then it also should highlight your gap or the research problem. In other words, so here's what people have done in the past, but we still don't have this information, or we still don't have a study designed to fill this gap. And then it sets up the need for your study, which is how the section should end, with what you're doing and why your study is needed. And that dovetails into the next section, which is the research problem. And this is just a more targeted and more explicit kind of statement, or it's about a paragraph. It can be a little longer, a couple paragraphs, of what your research problem is specifically. So to transition from the background, yeah, a more targeted kind of overview of, and here you can stay a little more recent with the research on your topic, to highlight what's been done. Come out and state your research problem specifically. It should be clear about what the actual research problem is. Like your readers shouldn't have to kind of dig around and guess about what it is. And specifically state how your study is designed to address that research problem, how it's designed to fill the gap in the literature, or whatever the research problem is. Okay, and I also recommend getting a hold, and you all have probably done this or know this, but just reminding you, get a good example of an approved dissertation in your area from your school. And this is because, you can read kind of all about how, these sections, how to put these sections together. You can attend webinars, but when you sit down to write, all these ideas kind of go out of your head. So it's always nice to have a concrete example at hand when you sit down to write. And it also shows you how other people have the moves that they've made and how they've handled some of these sections. The purpose statement, it's usually a paragraph, maybe two, but the purpose statement itself has to be very specific. And it's usually constructed in this way that you see. The purpose of this, and you ought to put your approach in your design. The purpose of this exploratory qualitative study, or the purpose of this quantitative correlational study. So you get your approach, qualitative, quantitative, your design in there, is to, and whatever you're going to be doing, examine, investigate. Sometimes if it's a comparison study, you would use compare. Explore is usually used with qualitative studies. So the purpose of this quantitative correlational study is to examine, and whatever it is you're going to be examining, the relationship between factor A and factor B, whatever those are, or is to explore the underrepresentation of African Americans in senior level coaching positions in college sports or something. So, so it leads to exactly what you are studying. This is where you put your specific sample and setting. In 7 college coaches and universities in the Southwest or something like that, whatever it happens to be for your specific study. And there I give a quantitative and a qualitative example. Again, they would just end again in your specific sample, whatever your specific sample would be using in your specific setting. The purpose may also include specific information about your variables, your major concepts, your instruments, to measure, let's say, self-efficacy. I will use the self-efficacy, Smith's self-efficacy scale will be used to measure I don't know, organizational effectiveness. Jones's, organizational effectiveness scale will be used. So sometimes you will have to include some specific information like that. Usually not a long section. And again, follow your template if you have one. Okay. Research questions, usually your research questions come in this area. Again, follow your template if they want it somewhere else. This is where you would state your research questions, but again, this is not a methods-based presentation, so we're not going to cover those, but check in on some of our other webinars for that. Usually the theoretical framework comes next, sometimes called a conceptual framework. What's the difference? I don't have a great explanation for that. All that I can tell you really is that theoretical frameworks are typically associated with quantitative studies, and conceptual frameworks are typically associated with qualitative studies. Don't ask me why that's so. I don't really know that it matters, other than that you kind of, get theoretical. If you're doing a quantitative study, call it a theoretical framework. If you're doing a qualitative study, call it a conceptual framework. So what the theory does, or the concepts, for qualitative studies, your framework helps guide your study. It helps explain your results, but it also helps guide your interview questions. For quantitative studies, your theory helps you to explain your study, to explain your results. I always say, people like to, they think they need, several theories. I always say keep it simple. And by simple, I mean streamlined. I don't mean, simple to the point of being just fundamental and basic. You mean streamlined, meaning if you can find one well-suited theory, fine. I mean, stay with it. I mean, you should only bring in other theories as if you really need them. Because remember, you're going to have to discuss each theory, link each theory to your study, and ideally link them back to your results. So the more theories you bring in, the more kind of work on those levels you have to do. So for the theoretical framework, I mean, just come out and it should be you should start with a simple statement of, Bronfenbrenner's social ecology theory will serve as a theoretical framework for this study. And in that sentence, you state who developed it. You should have a citation, a year for it. You should talk a little bit about what the person developed the theory for, what they developed it to explain, which should align with what you're studying. Talk a little bit about what researchers have used it for, different areas, different areas, different topics, different ways to explain maybe similar things that you're studying. And then the important thing is to talk about how it connects to your study, or how it'll help to explain your results. If the connection sometimes is not clear to people, sometimes it's more clear than others, but especially for something like a quantitative study, you can go to your scale or your instrument that you're going to use, and you usually want to have your theory aligned with the theoretical foundations of the scale. So, for example, if we're measuring something like self-efficacy, there are several scales and instruments to measure self-efficacy, right? But there's some different theories. Although the definitions are kind of similar, there's different theories about self-efficacy. So, if you're using Smith's theory of self-efficacy as the basis for your study, you don't want to use Jones's instrument that's based on Jones's theory. You want to use Smith's theory of self-efficacy that aligns with the instrument that you're going to be using. Okay, so if that makes sense, because these scales, these instruments that they develop to measure these certain, quantitative factors, they're based on concepts and they're based on theories. So again, it helps to make sure that your theory aligns with the theoretical foundations of the scale that you're using. But that's kind of the theoretical framework in a nutshell. All right, moving on. The nature of the study or study design. Just simple points, because again, this is a methodological component, which I'm not going to go into depth on. But basically, it provides a rationale for the selection of your design, summarizes the methodology, including who you're collecting data from, how you're collecting it, how the data will be analyzed. And again, yeah, if you're interested in more of that, seek out one of our methodological webinars. Okay, definition section. again, this shouldn't be too big. I see sometimes people, they just think they need to throw in all these definitions and, to add content or whatever. They have 30, 40 definitions. No, stop, time out. These are just definitions of the major concepts and terms associated with your study. So your factors, your variables, any major concept from your study should be defined, because it'll probably have a particular definition within your study. And these are definitions too. They're not discussions. I see people going for paragraphs on these, and they're not discussions. They're definitions. They're just how you're going to define this factor, self-efficacy, for example, how it's going to be defined for use in your study. And so usually you can get away with one sentence, two sentences, but they should be concise, short. For the purposes of this study, self-efficacy will be defined as, and just lay out the definition. Put them in the form of sentences, should be clear and succinct. Ideally, they need to be supported, to show the reader that they're not your definitions, or do not use dictionary definitions either, because these are not general definitions. These are specific definitions to the literature, to the research, and to your study. So support them with peer-reviewed sources, ideally, and always more recent is better. Just as a general rule of thumb. Of course, if you're using something that comes from a theory that's 10 or 15 years old, and it's particular to that theory, that's fine. But generally, when possible, things try to keep things recent. Significance. This is a section that you discuss. You're not conducting your study for no reason, right? So you're conducting it to address the research problem, but you're going to get information that can be used by other researchers. You're going to be getting information that can be used by practitioners. So this is a section where you talk about what you think might be the potential use of the findings of your study. How can your findings be significant? And usually there's two prongs to this. There's how they're going to be significant to the research, or how they can add or contribute to the research, and how they're going to be significant or how they can inform practice. Some schools like Walden also want a third prong called positive social change. Not all schools, just that one that I know of. We can talk about that in a minute. So basically, for research, think about how, what the information you're going to get, how that can inform research in the future. It might say, again, this is potential at this point because you haven't conducted the study yet. It might give us information on the theory you're studying that it's appropriate to study the topic that you're studying, or it's not appropriate. Or it may tell us that two factors are connected or not connected, and that means that we have to approach something in the research differently. So how might it contribute to the research? I see people oftentimes still just say, my findings will contribute to the research, and leave it at that. And then I'm like, well, that's great. We hope so, but you need to be a little more specific about what you're specifically doing and what you specifically might find, how that might contribute to the research. You can't just say that it will. Same things for practice. So, imagine you're talking to a coworker or something, and they say, "Oh, you did this study. What did you find that we can use?" So, how would you explain that to them? Like, how might your findings be usable for people that it involves at the level of practice? If you're doing an education study, what might your study findings mean for teachers? What might they mean for administrators? What might they mean for the actual practices on the ground? So that's the practical significance. And like I said, Walden has a third prong. They want positive social change, which is you don't need to. It doesn't take a lot of time to explain that, but it's in other words, how might it help society? How might it help the actual people that are involved? It's a little different than practice. You know, if it leads to people getting raises or being retained in their jobs, that leads to you know, more well-being for them, or them leading more productive lives. So that's kind of what they mean by social and positive social change. Okay. These other sections have kind of collapsed into one section here. Sometimes schools want them, sometimes they don't. Again, check your specific template. Limitations. Again, this is forward-looking because you don't know yet. It's like the significance section. It's kind of forward-looking. Just see if you can anticipate any potential weaknesses or shortcomings that may affect the results of your study. Obviously, we're still going through COVID, and that has, thrown wrenches into people's plans. So that might be, there might be some kind of potential limitation somehow there. Maybe you can't get the population of people that you want to. Maybe you can't get enough people, which is a big problem. If your sample size is low, that's a big problem for quantitative studies. So anything that you might foresee that could be a limitation, that's what you want to talk about here. Again, these sections don't need to be long. Paragraph, maybe a couple paragraphs. Assumptions, and also let me just backtrack just a minute. For all these sections, limitations, assumptions, scope, or delimitations, if you're stuck in a place about where to start, I mean, you can always start with a definition of limitations. Obviously anchor it with a peer-reviewed or recent peer-reviewed source, but a study limitation represents a weakness or shortcoming that may affect the results. You can start with a limitation of limitations of all of them, really. Assumptions are just things that you don't have control over, but you have to assume to move forward with your study. So a big thing is that for quantitative and qualitative research is that your participants are going to be honest and straightforward and give you the information you need. That's, you can't control what they say. You don't have control of them, so you just have to assume that. Scope, also called delimitations, and because it has the word limitations in it, it confuses people, and I can see why. But think of it as your scope of your study. It's basically what you're covering, what's within the scope of your study, and what's outside of the scope of your study. And so usually it kind of sounds like the purpose, I'm going to be focusing on these things. So if you're doing an education study and you're just focusing on teachers, you can just be specific about who you're focusing on, and you can make it clear that you're not focusing on students, you're not focusing on administrators, but just this group of teachers. So that's what they want. They want that kind of the boundaries of your study, like a description of the boundaries of your study, what you're focusing on and what you're not. Okay, and the summary, and like any summary, you're just recapping major points of the chapter, right? You also want to end by reminding the reader of the research problem and why your study is needed, why it's important to conduct. And you can end by transitioning to the next chapter. The next chapter will be chapter 2, which is a lit review, typically, which will include, analysis and synthesis of research on the topic. Okay, and we do have some questions. I'll get to those. This is our contact information, what we do. So if you think you're interested in just talking about what we offer as far as signing on for support, you can call or go online and use the contact information there. And again, everybody will be getting a copy of the PowerPoint. Okay, let me get to the questions here. All right. How is historical material for the background different from review of the research? I'm not, by review of the research, I'm assuming you mean review of the research, maybe for the research problem. There's no real difference between, I mean, the background material is partially a review of the research. So there's overlaps there. But say in the very introduction, as opposed to just the background, you know, it might be a little broader. It might be, you know, your organizational problem also. But yeah, there's a great deal of overlap between review of the research and the background, because the background is going to include some review of the research. And the review of the research, for example, for the research problem is usually more targeted. It's not as expansive as your background. Can you turn your proposal into your chapter 1? Is that typically done? Yeah, this is where we get into terminology issues. Because I'm not sure what you mean by proposal. Sometimes proposal means, typically your proposal is, or your chapters 1 through 3. This is what I'm proposing on doing. And then you collect your data, write up your results in chapter 4, and write up your discussion in 5. You may mean prospectus, or some schools call the proposal, like what you write before your chapters 1 through 3, the proposal. So whatever it is, that initial document before you start on your chapter 1, yeah, I mean, you wrote it. You can use whatever, you know, is applicable. If it's appropriate and applicable, you can use it. Sure. There's nothing that says you can't. And again, if it's your material, so you're not like plagiarizing yourself or anything. So, and I think ideally research should work that way. You know, you build from smaller blocks to larger projects. So yes. Question: what is the difference between significance in introduction section and the implications in discussion section? Good question. And one is the big difference is, one, you write in a future looking manner, meaning this may be the significance and the implications of my research. And in the chapter 5, you're writing it in the past tense, in the sense that, okay, I've already collected data. Now I can see better how my findings can have implications and significance. So you actually have the findings. That's the difference. And you can talk about it more specifically, in other words. So you have your actual results. Now you can talk about what these results will mean to research, what they will mean to practice. So there's a degree of certainty now, that here's how my results can inform these things, rather than at the beginning it's like my results, you know, may inform research, may inform practice in these ways. You have specific results that you can make these arguments or these claims based on now. What is the difference between theoretical framework and model? Another good question. It's a semantic thing. You know, a model is usually something that somebody built from theories. So it's a little more specific, I think. So you may have somebody's model that takes a piece from here and a piece from there and a theory from here, and they put it together as a model to study something very specific. So it's a little more kind of worked out, you know, as a way to study a topic than a theory, which would act as a theory acts as a framework. A model is a little more targeted. But certainly a model can act as your theoretical framework. I mean, if that's kind of what you're getting to, can you use a model as your theoretical framework? And it would be, yeah. Yes, you can use a model. You may have to talk a little bit about the theoretical underpinnings of the model, which would be entirely appropriate. But yes, a model can work as a theoretical framework. You're using such and such model to, to guide your research questions, to help you explain the results. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Let me see. We do have other ones. Okay. You're welcome. You're welcome. I think historical material versus review resource question might have been, what's the difference between the background section? I'm sorry, I'm kind of mumbling. I think the historical material versus review of research question might have been, what's the difference between the background section of an introduction and the literature review of chapter 2? Okay, I see. Yeah. Yeah, the literature review in chapter 2, obviously this is a bigger thing. This is a bigger kind of swath of research. So it is going to be research that is on your topic, but you're going to be able to cover more things. You're going to be able to get deeper into the research. I mean, you're going to be talking about, the kind of analyses that people have used, their purposes of their studies, their methods, and you're going to kind of be making comments on those things too, what worked, what didn't work. So yeah, you're going to have a more kind of a in-depth, detailed discussion and lit review. The historical material in the background in the chapter 1 is kind of a setup. It's kind of a broad stroke approach. You don't get into the details as much. You summarize kind of the trends and the major findings that show kind of the high points of the research and that help set up what's been done, which helps to set up what hasn't been done and sets up the need for your study. So yeah, there's a difference between those two things, that background material and the lit review material, in terms of the breadth, the scope, and also the depth of the material that you get into. Could you elaborate on the conceptual framework for qualitative studies? Yeah, the conceptual framework, sometimes they call it a conceptual framework because sometimes you don't always need a full-blown theory, like a theory of, whatever. You can take, because sometimes there's not. If you're exploring a topic qualitatively, there may not be a theory on precisely what you're exploring. So you want to take some major concepts that help explain or they're associated with what you're doing and maybe kind of bring those into, a framework. And so what the framework helps you to do is to, like in a quantitative, in a quantitative study, they help you to explain your results. But for qualitative, the conceptual framework is important because it helps to guide your interview questions. So when you sit down to draft interview questions, you're not going to be pulling them like, out of the air, right? You have to have, you have to have a basis of why you're asking specific questions. And that's where your conceptual framework comes into the picture. So whatever framework you're using, whatever major concepts you're using that are associated with your topic, you ask your interview questions based on those concepts in your framework. And again, now, the best thing I can tell you to do is like look at some qualitative frameworks, studies, look at the conceptual frameworks, see what people have done and how they've used it. But I mean, that's the major difference. You may not be able to use like one big theory. You may have to kind of pull associated concepts together to kind of create a framework to help guide your interview questions. What are the techniques to review previous research for the literature review? The lit review we do cover. I mean, for now, I'll give you a small answer, but we do have lit review webinars, and check our calendar to see when we're running that. But I run one on lit review specifically. Yeah, so there's some specific things you do. I mean, in that webinar, I talk about the overall purpose of the lit review. But I mean, as far as the depth of what you get into, I mean, you get into things like, you know, details. You know, what was the purpose of the study? What did they try to find out? You know, sometimes it gets into details of the setting and the population if it matters. Let's see. The purpose of the study, right? What they were trying to find out, the analysis, how they analyzed the data, that's important. Maybe the theories they used, and of course the findings are real important. And you want to kind of not only summarize all that, but kind of relate it to the findings of other studies that you're reviewing. So you create kind of a synthesis. But again, that's more in depth. I can get more in depth on that in the other webinar. What's the connection between research objectives, research questions, and research hypotheses? That's a good question for the research questions webinar. I mean, they should align, basically. You know, you're hypothesizing certain things based on what's in the research. That's what your research questions focus on. And they should align with your research objectives. But again, that's like another webinar on the research questions. Should I list abbreviations in the definition section or make it a separate section? I'm not sure what you mean by abbreviations. Oh, I see what you mean. So you're asking, I think, should acronyms be an entry, like an acronym, if you're using, say, APA or something, should an acronym be a definition entry? No, you handle that in the text. So the first time, you know, you write something out that you want to later use as an acronym, you put the acronym in parentheses after the first time you use it, and then you can use the acronym after that. So you don't need to define your acronyms in the definition section. That's a short answer. Okay, other questions? I think I got them all. Let's see. Can you use the terminology of hypothesis in qualitative research? Don't we usually say assumptions? No, qualitative research does not contain hypotheses. Assumptions. I mean, in qualitative research, you don't need, I mean, there's a section called assumptions, remember that right here, but that I don't think that's what you're talking about. Expectations is something like what you're assuming to find or what you're expecting to find. I mean, you can talk about that. I mean, based on the research or based on, you know, what other people have found, you can expect to find, but it's usually not typical that you have to expressly state your expected findings in qualitative research. I mean, and if you do, just frame them, just put them in terms of the expectations rather than hypotheses. Yeah, hypotheses is a quantitative term. You're welcome. Let's see. What is the difference between hypothesis and proposition? I'm going to tell you to go to the methods webinar and ask a methodologist instead of me. I'm not a methodologist. Okay, other questions? Yeah, and remember, just to remind everybody, we run these on specifically on, you know, like I just said, methods related issues, research questions, methodology, design. but also on other chapters too that don't involve methodology, like the chapter 2, the lit review, and also chapter 5, the discussion. So yeah, just check our calendar, see when we're running webinars on these different topics and these different sections, and sign up for those if you're interested. Great. I want to thank everybody for coming. Yeah, you do get a copy of the PowerPoint, and have a great day. Everybody stay safe. Thank you.